Hello, this is Group 5, and today we are going to talk about hegemonic transition. So, this is our table of contents. Before we start our presentation, we would like to share what our research question is and how we came up with this question. Our question is, could dynasty change from Ming to Qing be considered as a hegemonic transition? How did we come up with this question? So when we learned about hegemonic transition in class, a simple question came across our minds. The examples to explain hegemonic transitions were all Western cases. So were there any Asian cases of hegemonic transition? As long as we can remember, the hegemon of the Asian region has been China. Even though there were multiple dynasty changes throughout the history of China, we thought the hegemon always have been the Chinese dynasties. And although the Ming and Qing are both considered as Chinese dynasties, they were two different countries, and both were hegemons, which could make this a hegemonic transition. So before we begin, what is a hegemon? As you all already know, hegemon is the position of a country being the strongest and most powerful, and therefore able to control others. In the contemporary world, the United States is considered a hegemon. Then what is a hegemonic transition? A hegemonic transition is when a hegemon confronts a challenger. This is a transition model that we covered in class. In the first phase, the hegemonic system extends to the international community. Then, when we enter the hegemonic crisis, a rival country that resists the hegemonic power appears, and various conflicts arise within the hegemonic society. The third step is the breakdown of hegemony. At this time, the hegemonic system is in great chaos, and the system is reorganized by the new hegemonic power. Even if the centralization of the system is successful during the collapse phase, it will eventually face a new hegemonic confrontation and take the same steps. Before we move on to the actual transition, we wanted to make sure that the Chinese dynasties were, of course, the hegemons. Yes, as we already studied during class, Chinese dynasties were considered a hegemon. Of course, the Chinese dynasties militarily outpowered neighboring countries. In fact, in 1392, the Ming throne commanded some 16,000 military officers and 1.2 million soldiers. And in the mid-17th century, ran as high as 100,000 officers and nearly 4 million soldiers. By the middle of the 18th century, the total number of Qing military forces may have reached 800,000. Until the end of the 18th century, Qing's military forces were the world's largest. Not only that, Ming and Qing had advanced technologies that scholars from neighboring countries came to study abroad to learn them. Also, countries, including Korea, imitated many parts of the governmental system of China, such as public servant exam. But the main reason that shows China was a hegemon was, of course, the tributary system. We did already cover this in class, but it was quite a long time ago, so let me remind you once again. Any country who wanted to have a diplomatic or economic relation with China had to do certain things, such as sending their envoy to Beijing or send tributes. Yi Ziyang, the author of China's Hegemony, 400 Years of East Asian Domination, says that the fact that there was a social norm that it was the Chinese emperor that held the moral authority and the power to grant the titles to other neighboring countries, and not the other way around, proves that China was the hegemonic state. The social norm that China will always be on the part of receiving, and the Chinese emperor will always be on the part of granting titles, is the main point that proves the Chinese hegemon. So now that we've seen that Ming and Qing was definitely hegemons in the region, we would like to move on to how the dynasty change actually happened. The later Jin, which later becomes the Qing dynasty, was found in Manchuria by a person named Nurhaci. During that time, the Manchuria was consisted of many different Jurchen tribes and not a whole country. Nurhaci started to gain power around the region and conquered few Jurchen tribes. In 1587, he built a castle in Foala and set it as his base. Ironically, his power was supported by the Ming. At that time, the Ming dynasty's policy toward the tribes in Manchuria was to support them who are friendly and pays tribute to the Ming, and attack those who weren't. Nurhaci maintained his relationship with the Ming friendly and sent tribes to the Ming. With the support from the Ming, he traded ginseng and pelts and reinforced economic power, and at the same time conquered other Jurchen tribes one by one. In 1603, Nurhaci conquered every tribe except for the Yehe. Now that his power was too strong, the Ming attempted to contain his power and froze his trades of ginseng. In 1616, Nurhaci became the king of the later Jin. He declared 7 resentment against the Ming and started to attack the Liaodong area. The Yehe tribe fought on the side of the Ming. This is when the famous Battle of Sarhu happened. The Ming's army estimated to be 90,000 to 120,000, and the later Jin's army was to be 60,000. Although the Ming had bigger force compared to the later Jin, the Ming lost this battle. There are mainly 2 reasons why the Ming lost this battle. First, the Ming army, although they outnumbered the later Jin, the quality of their forces was considerably low compared to the later Jin. Its army were conformed of soldiers that lacked basic military training and did not have enough money to provide soldiers with proper weapons. Second, since many generals were warlords and that the army was factionalized, the Ming army did not have a powerful control center to command its forces. To be short, this battle was a consequence of messed up social, economic, and military situation of the Ming dynasty. Many scholars consider this battle the main turning point of the transition of hegemon from Ming to Qing. The Ming dynasty from the beginning strictly forbade eunuchs to participate in politics, since its predecessor had gone through many consequences due to eunuchs engaging in politics. However, in the late period of the Ming, a king allowed the eunuchs to take control of a certain ministry of the government. From that on, more and more eunuchs got to participate in politics, and even led to dictatorship of the eunuch called Weizong-shan, in Korean Wi Chung-hyun, which damaged the dynasty hard. Corruption became a common thing, and the conflicts between the political parties became aggressive and factionalized. Thus, they couldn't get anything done properly. Therefore, the situation for the peasants naturally became terrible. During the last stages of Ming, there were numerous peasants' uprisings. The most famous one is rise of Li Zicheng. His power grew powerful over the years. In 1644, Li Zicheng declared the formation of the Shun dynasty. In Beijing, the emperor made a last-ditch effort to raise an army from the civilian population and sent them out against Li. More than half the army deserted before they were even 100 li away from Beijing. Li advanced on the Ming capital in 2 directions. On 24th of April, one of the emperor's eunuchs ordered the gates to be opened for the rebels, but the guards refused. The defense shot off their cannons in a large show of force, but they had no ammunition. When the rebels realized that only powder was being fired, they attacked in force and took the city gates in a brief struggle. The emperor ordered the imperial family to commit suicide. Before hanging himself, he cut off the arm of one of the princesses who could not bring themselves to suicide. She was still alive the next day when the rebels found her. However, Li Zicheng's victory was short-lived. After the death of the emperor, the Qing army, with the Ming forces that surrendered to fight for them, attacked Beijing. Li Zicheng had to flee and was eventually killed. Ultimately, through battles, the king conquered the area and became the next hegemon of the region.
Hi, I'm going to be presenting on the similarities between the Ming-Qing transition with a couple cases of Western hegemonic transitions. We attempted to analyze the internal and external factors, those namely being economical and military, regarding the hegemonic transition from the British Empire to the US and from the Dutch Republic to the British Empire. We firstly decided to look into a case of a Western state and that faced an identical economic downturn as the Ming did and lost its previous global standing. This Western state was the British Empire. The hegemonic transition from the British Empire to the United States is considered to be one of the rare cases of a hegemony peacefully bequeathing its power to another state. I'd firstly like to briefly go over the ascension of the British Empire as a global hegemon and how the once the empire on which the sun never sets eventually started to head toward its downfall. Like other states in Europe, the British started expanding during the Age of Discovery, also called the Age of Expansion, from the 15th to the 18th century. Because of geographical reasons, Portugal and Spain were the initial states who commenced their expansions, and then the Dutch, French, and British jumped into the race, with England's Henry VIII calling upon the Italian John Cabot to lead a voyage headed for Asia. As the reign of Elizabeth I began, she encouraged piracy against Spanish and Portuguese ports and ships, one of those who looted the Spanish and Portuguese, namely being Sir Francis Drake. With the establishment of Virginia by Walter Raleigh and the East India Company, it initiated the colonization of North America and India respectively. The age of Pax Britannica, or British peace, actually accelerated after the end of the American Revolution in 1783. Contrary to some belief that Britain started its downfall after losing the American colonies, it reached the height of its imperialism. After losing the American colonies, it subsequently began to colonize other regions of the world on a wider range. For instance, Captain James Cook discovered the eastern coast of Australia in 1770 and claimed it for Britain. The first convict ships from Britain arrived in Australia in 1788 to establish settlements. The Australian colonies became lucrative exporters of wool and gold. Another vital colony was India, or the British Raj. India was considered to be the jewel of the British Empire for its significance in manpower and trade capacity. Both Britain and the Netherlands had challenged Portugal's spice trade monopoly with Asia and formed private joint stock companies in order to finance their voyages, and they even have a history of fighting against the Spanish together. The East India Company and the Dutch East India Company were consequently established in 1600 and 1602 respectively. Before the Indian Rebellion or Sepoy Mutiny in 1857, the East India Company had dominance over the country. However, Britain decided to exert complete control over India and dissolved the East India Company the following year. Britain was where the Industrial Revolution commenced, being called a workshop of the world, made possible with the combination of infrastructure development, advancement of transport and communication, and government guarantees on railways and shipping. However, after the cessation of the Second World War, Britain gradually started to decline as a global hegemon. mainly because Europe was devastated after the two world wars and had ensured the independence of several of its colonies, including India. Prior to the First and Second World Wars, Britain mass produced industrial products utilizing its modern factories from the raw materials that were forwarded to Britain from its numerous colonies. It would then trade the industrial products with other countries around the world, including some of its colonies. Britain's neglect of producing raw materials and disregard of the primary industry quickened the worsening of its economy. It overlooked the significance of agriculture and consequently became incapable of being self sufficient in food production, ultimately resulting in a crisis of food shortages. The United States had suffered numerous casualties after World War II as well, but it hadn't suffered as much as Europe had. The US was able to emerge as a potential global hegemon since the two world wars were not fought on American soil, and since it had grown substantially economy wise by supplying its European allies with military supplies, oil, and food. Not only there were commonalities between the two countries, such as in history, philosophy, and most importantly, language, there were also other factors such as the lack of democracy among other countries, the two wars, or technological innovation disrupting military advantage. This is why Britain was able to peacefully hand over its dominance over to the US. Unlike the peaceful transition from Britain to the United States, the Ming underwent a violent one. There were, however, similarities in the process of economic downturn. According to Timothy Brooks' book The Confusions of Pleasure, the Ming also faced shortages in their currency of silver. The problem emerged when the Ming was diminished in both national and regional prominence after it extensively aided the Korean peninsula with silver during the Imjin War. Additionally, another factor was because of the decline of trade with countries in Europe. The Ming originally acquired silver mainly by trading with Western nations such as Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands. For instance, Spain shipped approximately 150,000 to 345,000 kilograms of silver annually from its colonies in Mexico to China. However, due to Spanish and Dutch ships of silver intended to trade with the Ming being pirated by the British, the amount of silver arriving in Ming decreased substantially. We found the next determinants of the Ming-Qing transition from economic and military perspectives from the decline of the Golden Age of the Dutch. The four Anglo-Dutch wars were critical in the emergence of Britain as a hegemon and the decline of the Dutch Empire. The first three wars, stemming from commercial rivalry, established England's naval arising from Dutch interference in the American Revolution. The European colonies in the Caribbean were the most profitable, utilizing a system of sugar plantations which were first adopted by the Portuguese in Brazil. The plantations depended on slave labor, and the slaves were mainly provided by the Dutch. The Dutch Republic at the time was at the height of its power, where it reached its ascendancy despite the lack of political centralization, and emerged as a hub for international finance. Tensions were high between the Dutch and the British, with small-scale disputes such as the one in 1623, when members of the Dutch East India Company slaughtered members of the English East India Company in Indonesia. Tensions rose even further when members of the Dutch royal family financially aided the Royalists during the English Civil War. In 1651, the English Parliament decided to exclusively allow English merchant ships to trade in English colonies by passing the Act of Navigation, thus leading to the First Anglo-Dutch War commencing in 1652. England's forces were both larger in number and better armed, which enabled it to come out as the victor in major disputes. The war eventually ended with the signing of the Treaty of Westminster in April 1654. This would essentially strengthen England's hold in the Americas. The commercial rivalry of the two states led to conflict in the Second Anglo-Dutch War from 1665, after the English captured and renamed the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam to New York in the year before. Most battles that occurred during the war were, however, won by the Dutch. A plague in 1665 and the Great Fire of London in 1666 contributed to British defeat, along with its navy being obliterated at Chatham in 1667. The war ended the same year. The two rival nations clashed again in the Third Anglo-Dutch War, with neither emerging as the victor. Then they were allied for a century before going to war again in the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War over the Dutch trading with the American colonies in 1780 to 1784. The Dutch economy had already slowed by 1720 due to its merchants using London as their financial base. By 1780, the per capita GNP of Britain exceeded the Dutch, and the Dutch were not pleased with this fact, which eventually led to another war between the two states. The British Navy crushed the Dutch with a series of blockade impositions before they could assemble a proper force capable of naval combat. This will ultimately instigate the decline of the Golden Age of the Dutch, and the British would later seize the remainder of all Dutch colonies in 1814. Internally, the decentralized condition of the Dutch provinces, along with the imbalance of wealth, power, trust issues, political differences all played a part in the downfall of the Dutch. Similarly, the Ming was experiencing frequent peasant uprisings, in addition to the most of the political power of the state being focused on the eunuchs. However, not unlike the collapse of the Dutch Golden Age, the paramount element that led to the downfall of the Ming dynasty was international conflict between states in the East Asia region. The Ming were already deteriorating, both politically and economically, until it was further weakened after sending troops to the Korean Peninsula during the Imjin War. It was at this point the Ming, already greatly diminished, was forced to protect its lands from the Qing. The ultimate blow, however, was struck by an internal uprising started by a peasant farmer named Li Zicheng.
I know that you are tired by now of listening to a bunch of historical events, so let me briefly tell you what our presentation was about and wrap this thing up. So our research question was, can Ming-Qing dynasty change be considered as a hegemonic transition? We know that Ming and Qing dynasties were definitely a hegemon around the region based on the tributary system and many advancements in military and technology. Also, we compare the dynasty change to two different Western hegemonic transitions, which were Britain to US and Dutch to Britain. There were a few commonalities. First, in economy, there were both downfalls of the hegemon due to expenditures based on wars. Also, there were internal conflicts. The Dutch society was divided due to imbalance of wealth, power, and political differences. The Ming was also in a similar situation as well. Due to eunuch dictatorship and corruption, the political parties were extremely factionalized. Also, the uprising and rebellions of the peasants was a grave issue, which led to the downfall of the dynasty. Lastly, both countries had external conflicts of a challenging hegemon, the Dutch with the Britain and others, and Ming with the Qing forces. Although Ming and Qing dynasties are often considered the same Asian Chinese dynasties, they were two different countries, both a hegemon. Therefore, our answer is that Ming and Qing dynasty change could be considered a hegemonic transition. Thank you for your attention.